After the loss of her husband, Janet Milliken uprooted with her kids and moved to a small town in Pennsylvania. She was proud of her new home and her decision to start fresh. One day, the previous owner was helping Janet adjust her water heater. In conversation, the prior owner told her that an accident involving a firearm happened in the house before he owned it. The remark stuck with Janet for a while until she finally confronted a neighbor about what happened in her house. The neighbor told of parents who had a troubled marriage. One morning, the husband walked into the bedroom, shot his wife, and then himself. The murder-suicide orphaned the children and traumatized the quaint, secluded neighborhood. The next owner quickly renovated the property to increase its value, then sold it to Janet. The story not only stuck with Janet, but also made her aware that her and her kids weren't the only ones in the house. Several times, she and her kids experienced paranormal activity. One afternoon, while Janet was visiting her sister, Janet's son Ryan called begging her to come home immediately. When she arrived, he explained that he was doing homework in the kitchen when he felt someone breathing on his neck. He turned around to see a man's dark shadow move in the hallway, and he was the only one home. Soon, Janet was being awakened at night by a child's voice calling out, but after searching the house, all was quiet. On other occasions, she'd hear footsteps on the stairs, only to discover that her kids were fast asleep. Her normally calm dog began having barking fits, and when Janet went out to dinner with her kids one evening, they returned to find their dog dead and stuck in a bag of dog food. The final straw came on the anniversary of the murder-suicide. Janet woke up to Ryan screaming. He was awoken by a dark figure with green eyes in the corner of his room. When his eyes caught the digital clock on his nightstand, the display read hell. Janet filed a lawsuit against the prior owner and the listing agent for not disclosing the murder-suicide. The trial court sided with the former owner, holding that Pennsylvania law did not recognize murders as a material defect that needed to be disclosed. Janet appealed. The case eventually reached the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The court handed down its ruling that purely psychological stigmas are not material defects that sellers must disclose. The decision devastated Janet. With no award from the lawsuit, all she had left were her children and whatever else was in store for them at 12 Pickering Trail.
All right, welcome back. So this case was kind of fun. We get a little bit of the murder and we get a little bit of paranormal stuff, right? So we put the paranormal activity in there to really see the whole scope of what happened. There was actually a write-up in a local magazine there that went through the entire story, even down to the appraiser coming out and appraising the house. Now, interestingly, in this case, to find the loss of value, they hired this nationally known appraiser out of California who specializes in these types of tainted, stigmatized houses. A lot of hauntings, bad histories, things like that. So that is a story that you can go and look at and read, but we took out what was really relevant as far as her story goes. But as far as the legal case goes, the hauntings, the paranormal stuff was not ever alleged. So if you research and find this case and read up on the case, you're not going to find the paranormal activity because it was never brought up in trial. The issue at trial, or the issue in the case, was simply a matter of disclosure about the murder-suicide. Hauntings, not even talked about. So this case, Milliken versus Giacano, happened just a few years ago, 2014. This is not old. And so the court sitting in Pennsylvania had the luxury, right, of looking at what has transpired in the last 20 years of case law regarding stigmatized properties. And they actually did look at the Reed v. King case, which we just talked about. And of course, as you see, the Pennsylvania case, the court not convinced that murder-suicide is a material fact that needs to be disclosed, even with the proof of a loss of value. So what's the difference? Why? What's the difference between the Pennsylvania court and the Reed v. King California court? Why would one say that murder is a material defect and the other say it is not? and the outcome is the same. Let's assume loss of value for both. Let's say Mrs. Reed, she actually proves her case that she had a loss of value. So what? Why the difference? Why do we got opposite ends of the country holding differently with the end result? Well, that's a good question, and that's kind of the beauty of our individual state systems, right? As we get to experiment on what each state feels is the correct way to go. But specifically, the Pennsylvania court held, because some deaths don't bother some people, but others do, it would be impossible to determine which types of deaths would become material facts. So the court was open and acknowledged the fact that it could be material to a lot of people. But where do we draw the line, right? If we're talking about this global umbrella of death in a house, does that need to be disclosed? The court said no. So underneath that umbrella, what type of deaths would need to be disclosed? Certainly murder is a sensitive subject, but what about suicide? What about a terminal illness? What about a peaceful passing? I mean, the court says, how do we look at all of these and figure that some people are going to be affected by this, but not that? Some people are going to be affected by that, but not this. Does the age of the victim have a role to do with that? In Reed v. King, we had children that died. In Milliken versus Giacano, it was just the parents. So is that a factor? All good questions, and the court comes down and basically at the end of the day says there are too many hairs to splice, and we are not going to go down that road. So as a matter of law, the general rule is murders, suicides, not need to be disclosed. Do you agree? So on that note of an umbrella that covers all these different topics of how people die in their home, we see, again, this was 2014, so we see that case law really starting to build here, and there's not a lot of it, so I don't want to give the wrong impression. But we see case law starting to build where at least we now see that the deaths are really treated a lot the same. We got suicide treated exactly the same as murder. And does that make sense? That disclosure of murder, if it's not going to happen, does that mean that suicide also doesn't need to be disclosed? In other words, would certain buyers be more affected by a suicide than a murder, or vice versa? Well, the courts, start to see this, and they say, the Pennsylvania court sees this and says, nope, they're all treated the same. Death is death, and yes, we understand some people are more sensitive to this type of death than that, but in general, because it's just fragmented pieces of the population, we're not going to have a mandatory requirement that they disclose it. Of course, if it's important to them, they can go ask, and the seller can't lie, that would be fraud, but we're not going to make a mandatory rule that says you have to disclose the death in the house, no matter how it happened. So that brings us to the current state, virtually, because that case was only a few years ago, and we see that the majority of states out there hold the similar rule, that death does not need to be disclosed no matter how gruesome, no matter how horrible, no matter how tragic it was, or no matter how peaceful it was. They do not need to be disclosed affirmatively. There is no legal duty to do that. But again, if the buyer asks, they've got to disclose it. Minority of states went the other way, like California. And they're not the only ones. There's a few that say you have to disclose it, but you have a time frame to do it. After 3 years, it's not an issue anymore. So, out of curiosity, what do you think? It's a kind of an interesting question to kick around because until now you might have been only familiar with a certain state's law, and now you're seeing a variety come around and you're seeing different rationales for each, right? You're seeing the states like California that says it is a material fact because it affects value. Therefore, if you prove value, you win, loss of value. And then you're seeing Pennsylvania that says, you know what? Nope, we don't see it. Even though we have evidence from the appraiser that says loss of value happened, we still don't see it. It's a psychological thing, not a material thing. So we see that the courts are starting to split. We see it go different ways. We see legislatures follow, and now we're seeing where the span of the map is, right? We see the majority of the states, not a requirement to disclose. We see the minority of the states that it is. So if you have a buyer, and this is an issue, important issue for them, you might want to go to, right there on your screen, deathinhouse.com. And the buyer can fill out a report on that house and get a report on all the deaths that have happened in that house, if any, and then they can make that determination. From there, if they now want to have a paranormal test and crew come out and then be on TV and be famous. All right, so what about a famous celebrity that dies, or a home that was just, it blew up in the news and now everybody knows that property was the scene of that. So it's no longer just this little crime that happened. That there was a murder there and it never really made big press. But what about a big case like Nicole Brown Simpson, Ron Goldman, the O.J. Simpson case? Nicole Brown's property was all over the news. Now everybody knows it. What about, again, like Stambovsky, the non-local, someone who's been hiding under a rock and has no idea and comes in? Does the fact that the publicity of the house make a material issue that needs to be disclosed? Or is the fact that it's so highly publicized make it a non-disclosure issue? Good questions. In fact, in that house, I believe, if I remember correctly, they went and had to renovate the entire house, change it so that it looked not like hers anymore, not like the home that was on TV where a murder happened. It looked completely different when it was time to resell. So, good questions. Now you see mostly, where courts are leaning and why, and the legislature follows by putting laws in the books that either back up or change the court's ruling. But the courts are the ones leading the way in this issue because that's where the litigation goes, right? That's where these issues arise, and then we look to the courts to see what happens, and the court says, in most part, you know what, death is death, it doesn't need to be disclosed. Or if you're in the minority of states, it does need to be disclosed, but you have a certain time frame. So again, make sure you know your state laws, and if you have a buyer, send them to that website if that's important to them, and always ask the seller too. Get the seller on record. All right, so that wraps up murder. That wraps up the gory stuff. Let's move on to something a little bit not bloody, but sinister. Let's talk about stalking.